The DickHeads are presented in color.
Hello, DickHeads! Like a pink laser beam of truth beaming from all over the country to your brain hole. We have guests in Seattle, Orange County, San Diego, and Massachusetts here to talk on a very special topic, one that I know you guys are really excited to get into, and that is the Valis incident of 1974. The reason we're talking about it is because that's where we are in the Philip K. Dick canon as far as reading for the podcast. And I am so excited about this panel that we have assembled. I'm going to introduce everybody, and then we'll just get into it. First, joining us is Tessa Dick, who, yes, you might recognize that last name. Okay. Tessa is an author, and she has written books on the subject of Philip K. Dick, including Conversations with Philip K. Dick and Philip K. Dick, Remembering Firebright. And you're also working on a book on this very topic, but you're also the only person here who had a son with Philip K. Dick and and was living with him during this incident. So, Tessa, thank you so much for joining DickHeads today.
My pleasure.
For your second time, you were on the podcast recorded in Colorado as well. So, and one of our most popular episodes. So, we're very thankful to have you back. Also joining us is William Sarill,
Sarill,
sorry. Everyone's going to laugh because I always pronounce names wrong. Now, Bill, you are a biochemist, an energy healer, and a spiritual teacher. You've been doing all that stuff for 35 years. But you came to know Philip K. Dick as a house guest, and we'll get more details on that in a little bit. But you are really important to us because you were a close friend of Phil's when he was alive, and have a lot of thoughts on the Valis incident. And I couldn't do this without you. I wasn't going to do this without you. So I had to have you here. Thank you for joining DickHeads.
thank you. Looking forward.
All right. And our final panelist, at the request of David Gill, a popular guest on our podcast, is Ted Hand. Ted is a public school teacher and a longtime participant in the PKD fan community. And if you've been a part of this community, you've seen his talks from the Philip K. Dick Festival online, or you're familiar with his tarot cards, which he designed. I'm correct on that, right? You helped design the tarot cards. You were a longtime assistant to Grania Davis, and you've done a PKD and religion blog for many years, which has collected notes on the Exegesis and Phil's Gnosticism, and that's why you had to be here today. So, Ted, welcome to the DickHeads podcast. You're muted. Sorry.
Let me make a quick note about Bill that might help to give a window into my interests here. Sure. Bill was present for this conversation with Phil that apparently had a big deal to do with the inspiration for Maze of Death. And there's an unpublished document, the so-called Maze of Death theology that's floating around on the internet. I got it from Patrick Clark. That's a really cool read, and lays out sort of pre-exegesis some of the like weird like cosmological theological ideas that were part of the inspiration to the Valis experiences in 74.
Yeah, and anyone who's listened to our episode on Maze of Death, we talked about Bill a lot. His ears were ringing a lot that day when we recorded that, I'm sure. So yeah, the Maze of Death connection is definitely very important too, because I think it's a lot of Phil's theological ideas. So we'll get into that. So let's go around and start with how you first met Phil or his work. Tessa, you didn't know who Phil was before the first time you met him. Am I correct?
Right. Interestingly, years later, when I started taking classes at Chapman College, one of the professors asked me whether I was related to Phil Dick. And I said, well, yeah, you know who he is? Because nobody did. But he had quite a fan base among academia.
Mm-hmm.
No, when I met him, his girlfriend had dumped him and he was being clingy. So she was trying to find someone else for him.
Right. And then,
Go figure.
right. But did you know much about his religious or theological views? Like, did that come up early on in meeting Phil?
Well, the I Ching came on early, and plus his friendship with Bishop Pike, the author of The Other Side, where he tried to contact the spirit of his dead son through seances. And Phil and his third wife, Nancy, attended some of those seances. So they're mentioned as an acknowledgement in the preface or foreword. Forget what he called it. Anyway, so Phil had a mystical side, but it, just over time it developed that he was a faithful Episcopalian, but he wouldn't go to church because of all his phobias.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about how different the Valis incident would have been if Bishop Pike was still alive and somebody that he could talk to. It's one of those things that those kind of what ifs that,
Yeah.
I mean,
Phil,
him being gone, Bishop Pike being gone is a part of the story in a lot of ways. So.
Right. But Phil did spend a lot of time with the Episcopal priest in the local parish, one-on-one, discussing religion. And when my son was kicked out of a Lutheran school for not going to Sunday school, Phil went with us to talk to the principal and try to change his mind. And he demonstrated a very deep knowledge of not only the scripture, but also theology. Didn't work, but oh well.
Well, and Bill, how did you become friends with Phil? Because I believe you knew Phil a little bit earlier than Tessa, right?
Yeah.
A couple of years. How did you meet Phil?
I'd always admired his work. I found, for a lot of reasons, he was not just a great science fiction writer, but really inspirational to me in a lot of ways. And I'd contacted some people who knew him. Phil was very friendly with the fan community. He was basically a fan himself. And I contacted Terry Carr, an old friend who was a science fiction editor at that point, and talked to him about Phil. And he said, well, you could just write him. And I did. And exchanged letters with him and said that this was like 1968. And I said I was thinking of coming out to the World Science Fiction Convention in Berkeley. That was BayCon, the World Science Fiction Convention. I went out there, met him, and it was kind of like an instant connection. Nancy was there too, and he invited me to stay with them. I didn't want to push it too far, but I wound up staying with him for a total of a month in two-week periods. And it was during the second of those in the fall, October, really, of 1968, that he was working on Maze of Death. And we used to have these long conversations that would run up until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning about all kinds of stuff. It's though we're college roommates, just talking about the wonders of the universe, the mysteries of creation, all that sort of stuff. And it was just a lot of fun. I didn't realize he was turning it all into a book until he contacted me that December and said, I'm giving you credit for what you've our discussion that helped inspire some of we had a theological discussion about the nature of God, starting with fundamental principles, like basically what you need in order to postulate a God, and what would such a God be like. And it evolved in his mind into this sort of a much more elaborate understanding, which is present in Maze of Death, that has elements, Gnostic elements, as well as Christian elements in it. Then the book itself was published in 1970.
Mm.
And I stayed in touch with them. In fact, I visited Phil and Tessa, I think it was 1976, and stayed with them for a few days. And periodically, whenever I was in California, I would stop by and visit Phil. We had conversations over the phone. We exchanged emails, or snail mails rather, in those days. and I, stayed friends with him up until the time of his death.
Right. And it's got to be interesting because, I know lots of authors too, being a writer myself, and I know how I can see a lot of my friends in the books that I read when I read them. So I'm sure it's a very different experience for you reading Philip K. Dick than it is for us, for both you and Tessa, and but especially Maze of Death. And so I'm excited once we get into this, Bill, to get more of your thoughts on specifically these things, but we'll come back to you. Ted, you're more like me. You came up as a fan. I know you said you were 2 years old when Phil passed. I was 6, so we're from a much younger generation who met Phil through the books. And I'm assuming it was a book that you've read first. How did you first get introduced to Phil?
My first book is Eye in the Sky, which to this day I still consider to be like the paradigmatic PKD novel. Like, if you want one that is the most exemplary of his weird style or something, that you might point to that one. I'm
a huge Eye in the Sky fan, by the way. So
it's the multiple perspective narrative par excellence. So
I think it's his first masterpiece, in my opinion.
Yeah, arguably. Or is it TOJ? I was a kid in the 90s. I was a teenager on the cusp of Gen X. My older cousin, who was decidedly Gen X, was this kind of punk rock hipster type, and he was reading PKD as sort of like being part of that hipster scene. You're reading Maximum Rock and Roll magazine and going to Sonic Youth concerts, and Sonic Youth, of course, were big fans of PKD. Maybe that was how he heard of them. And I remember his girlfriend at the time was reading, when I was 17, 16, and visited him, and his girlfriend was reading the Lawrence Sutton Divine Invasions biography of Phil Dick, and which I imagine must be close at hand. So I was just ready for you to hold that up. And,
I always have it beside me when I'm doing a podcast, so just in case.
I was I was 16 years old, I was like, why would you be reading the biography of the author instead of his books, right? And, get to college, come to find out, the biography, as Robert Anton Wilson said, is more exciting than a spy novel, if you're interested in these theological twists and turns that we've come to discuss. And so I had a rash of synchronicities, surrounding Phil Dick. A bunch of my friends are getting into him, and it was just sort of in vogue in the counterculture, right? And but also I'm interested in how Phil was also an influence in the sort of occult culture, the occult, the cultic milieu, as other people put it, in the Western esoteric tradition. A lot of people who are into Rosicrucianism or whatever, might have been inspired by Phil Dick to go down a more mystical path.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we'll get more into your story with this as we go on, but I'm sure it'll leak in. And I've mentioned this on the podcast many times before, but I was actually born in March of 1974. So right at the, as you said, Ted, I've got Valis in my rising sign. So
classic synchronicity.
Yeah, March 19th, 1974. So I was right when I read Divine Invasions, and I read that, I was, of course, immediately said, I don't know what a podcast is, but one day I'll do a Philip K. Dick podcast. So, but yeah, so I've always had a real interested in the Valis thing and what went on. And I try not to cast judgment on what I think happened or didn't happen. I'm going to take Phil at his word for the purposes of this podcast. And, I wasn't there like some of us that are here, or able to talk to him at the time. So that's why I gathered this panel, because, I just think it's a really important thing that happened to Phil. So I'd like to next ask Bill and Tessa both, but what was it like to hang out with Phil? Because I think a lot of us would like to know, starting with Bill, what was it like to just, though you said it was like a college roommate, but what was it like to spend an evening just shooting the shit about the universe for Phil? Like, can you give us a glimpse of that? I know you kind of did a little bit, but
For me, it was the most entertaining thing I could conceive of. I mean, we would spend hours talking about his books. I'd ask questions about particular books, themes, and any of his ideas that particularly appealed to me, the origin of these, and so forth. But we also got into I was a grad student in physics at the time, theoretical physics. So we got into discussions of physics, but I'd always been interested in philosophy and in theology as well. And Phil was really a mentor to me as regards those. I learned an awful lot about Gnosticism afterwards, not really before that, although I had some familiarity with the pre-Socratics. But it was, I had just enough awareness to be able to tap into what he was talking about and ask the right kinds of questions. And it was kind of like bouncing ideas back and forth, like we'd excite or stimulate each other with some new mental construction that was enormously gratifying. That was the evenings. Actually, it was pretty much during the day too, but in the evenings when things got really quiet. Isa was, I think she was around 6 months old at that time, his daughter with Nancy. Nancy was very kind and helpful and facilitated, very sweet, really, facilitated everything for the stay. But the focus was on me and Phil until I drained him of as much insight and knowledge as I possibly could. And even then, it wasn't enough. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it's cool because then now we get to benefit from that and from your experience. And one thing I've noticed from interviewing, for example, Barry Maltzberg or Norman Spinrad, is that they always mentioned Phil calling them in the middle of the night. So I imagine that he's up late and just has these thoughts, and then he's like, "Oh wait, I gotta call Barry Maltzberg and tell him about such and such." And so it was very funny to hear these stories. And Maltzberg, for example, didn't know Phil very well, but said that his only interactions with him were these like middle of the night calls.
Yeah.
And so it's very funny to hear about that.
Well, this was kind of like a live-in middle of the night call.
Right. Tessa, I'm sure you had to facilitate more than one of those conversations or be part of those conversations. As a spiritual thinker yourself, I'm sure you had a lot of fun with some of these visits. Do you have any memories or anecdotes before we get into Valis about some of these visits that you had?
I remember passing out and sleeping on the couch while Phil was still talking. He could get by on very little sleep, but I can't.
Yeah. Well, I bet some of those conversations got into your brain other ways too, though. That's great as well.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead.
Shortly after his mystical experience, he was composing a novel about it. And in conversations with people who didn't know him so well, they assumed that he was talking about things that really happened to it. Mm. And more than one thought he was just nuts. But he was really spinning out possible plots for a novel. And when he realized that they thought it was true, he just went with it, had fun with it. And
Absolutely.
of course, people thought he was nuts.
Well, let's get in. Let's get into the Valis incident and what was going on at that time. This was right before the release of Flow My Tears, which came out later that year, I believe, or a little bit into the year. But Phil had only had one book released over that time period, or during the 4 years that he kind of worked on again, off again on Flow My Tears with We Can Build You. So I'm sure he was really excited or gearing up towards the release of Flow My Tears, and I'm sure that was a very big deal. But it was a dental surgery that happened right before this that was kind of like the kickoff of this. Right. And so he was in pain and was waiting for this prescription. Does anybody want to jump in with their thoughts on this first inciting incident?
Well, first of all, people thought he had not been writing for several years and that he'd burned his brains out with drugs and couldn't write. But the fact is, he was writing, he just wasn't publishing. It takes at least a year to get a book out, and his books took 2 or 3 years. And when his house was broken into in San Rafael, before I met him, his manuscripts were stolen.
Well, and so, luckily,
fortunately, he had, Roger Zelazny had a copy of the manuscript for Deus Irae, and his divorce lawyer had a copy of the manuscript for Flow My Tears.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Yeah, and
but there was a third novel that they took both copies, and he just never tried to write it again.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating to know.
So there he is, a total baby, wouldn't go to the dentist, finally was in so much pain he went to the oral surgeon to have a bad tooth extracted. He called it a wisdom tooth, but it wasn't. It was a molar.
Right. And so it's funny because the toothache really kind of plays a role in this too, right?
He had a bad infection in his mouth, and before and after the surgery, he was in terrible pain. The Novocaine was wearing off when he got home.
Well, and
we went by taxi, so we didn't take the taxi to the pharmacy. We had them deliver his pain medication.
Right.
The golden fish pendant is a red herring. That's in the novel, not in real life.
Okay, see, because that is thought of to have been real life, but you're saying the golden fish pendant was not a real thing. That was only in the novel.
Well, she was wearing a fish pendant, and he did ask her about it. But it was when he turned around that this silvery sticker in our window caught the sunlight and temporarily blinded him. And that sticker, coincidentally, was the fish sign. So while he was temporarily blinded, he kept seeing the fish sign in pink letters. It's phosphine activity, common reaction to being blinded by a bright light. And he went into the bathroom and took 2 of the pain pills instead of 1 and went to lie down. They were a pretty powerful opioid called Percodan.
Right. So what I'm wondering too is how long after this first thing did Phil start to talk about these ideas that something had happened to him? Was it right away?
Yes, he slept for a while because of the pain pills. And then he started talking that evening that he was recovering memories that he had lost.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, Bill, in your experience, because we've heard a lot about Phil from in these situations where he's talking about certain books, for example, like Man in the High Castle and Time Out of Joint and eventually Flow My Tears, is that with some of these books, he talks about these as being recurring memories or memories that he has of some other thing or some other universe or some other time or place. Is this a discussion that you had with him ever in your experience?
I did, but I don't recall the date. I'm not sure if it was before the Valis event or not. I do
Mhm.
remember that we were talking about John Brunner, whom both of us had met at the 1968 World Science Fiction Convention in Berkeley. And it was John Brunner who turned him on to the idea of anamnesis, recovery of lost memory, which is actually in the Plato's writing, I believe. Ted can support that, I believe. So I don't recall. I can't be certain. I need some anamnesis myself here, so I can recover the memory of whether that was in '68 or a bit later. But I do recall talking with him that I think it probably was later that John Brunner had sort of suggested this idea to him.
Mhm.
And that's where he came up for. I also wanted to amplify what Tessa had said before about the tooth extraction. He did receive a dose of sodium pentothal, which is similar. It's a barbiturate that's similar to Amitol, loosely called truth serum. It's used to elicit information from like repressed memories or that sort of thing, or to force people to tell the truth is largely unfounded, largely spurious.
Mhm.
It may have been experimented with in the early 50s by CIA or whatever. However, it is known to be a central nervous system depressant, and that when it wore off, which it wears off fairly quickly, the rebound from that may have flipped him from a depressed into a manic state. Also, the pain played a role in all of that as well. So he was sort of primed. I think he was primed physiologically and psychologically. I mean, he would have what I would say is manic depressive illness, not necessarily manic depressive psychosis. That's a whole separate subject we could talk about, but this isn't the place for it. But a lot of the time he spent being depressed, but he could go into these manic or hypomanic periods. And one of them could very well have been triggered off by the events of the surgery, the pain, the pentothal wearing off, who knows, the opioids, and the rest of it. I can also give additional context. I mean, what I'd like to say is I want to contextualize his experiences
Sure.
as relatively common spiritual experiences, especially among spiritual seekers, which he certainly was, rather than as a mental aberration or a signifier of psychosis. I don't think he was psychotic, although he veered close to the edge at times. He was deeply neurotic, and that has to do with circumstances having to do with his upbringing that we need not get into right here. But to me, the revelations that he received during the Valis experience were what I would call spiritual emergences or emergencies. And that's something that most people who study PKD don't really have a handle on, because they're either too materialistic or they don't lack any direct spiritual awareness of such phenomena. I think that the closest someone has come to describing what went on to Phil spiritually is Kyle Arnold, who wrote the book The Divine Magnus of Philip K. Dick, which you may be familiar with. It's good in some regards. I like it, but he doesn't. He basically says he ascribes Phil's behavior in part to his amphetamine psychosis. I wouldn't call it that. He was certainly habituated to amphetamines at a certain point. It helped him with his asthma, Benzedrine in particular, and later it helped him write at a prodigious pace when he needed to support the succession of wives and family. But he was off that.
1964, I think, is the year with all the novels.
The craziest period was right around 1964 when he was running around Berkeley with his friend J.K. Newcomb with guns and leaving buckets of diapers on whose porch was that? Grania's porch? I don't remember the whole story. Anyway, he was a bit nuttier at those points, but he cleaned himself out to a large extent, and I don't think he was psychotic at all.
No, he never took meth in the whole time I knew him. 72 till his death 10 years later.
Yeah, I think people have a misunderstanding that they think that he was heavily using during this period, and he wasn't, and that was, I mean, I think some people have the misunderstanding that they think he was heavily using basically until the end, and so it's really important to clarify, the record on that specifically, because I think the Valis incident for that. Ted, you had a comment?
However, and I do agree, that the drug thing is overblown. I would love to ask Tessa one anecdote. There is a moment in the selected letters around this period, or a little later, where Phil was high on some marijuana. He said a friend left a joint. I forget who he was writing the letter to, and he called Tessa up. And he said, I'm open to the collective unconscious. Ask me anything. And so, Tessa, do you remember that conversation and what you guys talked about?
No. Are you sure I'm the one he called?
Yeah, it's in one of the letters somewhere. He was high and he asked you to access the Jungian collective unconscious by asking him anything.
Well, as one does.
As one does.
Wow. Well, that would have been probably around 1980. Do you know the date of the letter?
That sounds right. It sounds like around that time.
I mean, he called me often, but I don't remember any specific conversation.
Yeah,
I'm sure
you got those calls a lot.
I probably asked him, what is the meaning of life? Because he was always asking people that exact question.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have a scoop here, I think. I don't know if this has ever been discussed, but one other PKD and drug story that we were talking about before we got started, and Tessa said there's no third rails here, so I hope it's fair game that I ask. But Tessa, you've told me that right before he died, Phil called you about a week before and said that he had gotten some cocaine.
Well, actually, I was there at his apartment with our son when he said that. And I advised him strongly to get rid of it because it would kill him. He had high blood pressure and he wouldn't take his meds for that. I don't know whether he ever used it.
Well,
but I hope he didn't.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, and I'm sorry about the dog fight, people.
It's likely.
And his neighbors next door confirmed that he did have the cocaine.
I agree. It would have been hard.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bill.
I agree. It would have been really harmful for him to use it, and in fact, his premature death may have been precipitated in part by his previous amphetamine abuse, which has similar effects on the cardiovascular system.
Also, being born premature, he was under 3 pounds when he was born, and they did not expect him to live. That will make you die young.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's heavy stuff, and I'd like to.
Yeah.
I understand why we want to talk about it, but I want to get back to the Valis thing. So, to what we're 1974. So in 1974, too, like after I think a lot of times he obviously invented the fish pendant or gave more credence to the fish pendant in the novel. Ted, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts to why that was so important for him to put more importance of it in the fictionalized version of the events than it actually was in reality.
So, I've had a lot of conversations with Gil about, what was Phil doing here with all of this? Why was he spinning out these stories, right? We know that he was an inveterate bullshitter, right? He loved to sort of just make stuff up. He loved to put people on. He loved to kind of like with pranks. And, Tessa says people thought he was crazy, but was he just putting them on? Was he kind of enjoying seeing how far he could go with it? And, another theory that Dave Gill thinks about a lot is Freud's theory of narcissism. Like, did it make Phil feel important that he was coming up with these theological discoveries? Now, I'm inclined to believe that he had some serious, there was some reality to these mystical experiences. And even if he wasn't, always telling the truth about something that happened to him, there's some truth there. There's a reason why he's fictionalizing the experiences in the way that he does. And so another thing I'd love to get Tess on the record talking about, which may be a good segue, I hope it doesn't get us too far afield, is the diagnosis of his son Christopher's, was it an inguinal hernia? There was some kind of a medical ailment, and I think Tessa has debunked this. And Dave Gill really wants to know what's the story with diagnosing Christopher's inguinal hernia? Was this really like a mystical revelation of information, or did he fictionalize that too?
He exaggerated and embellished, but it did happen. Our son had an inguinal hernia. We didn't know that. But Phil was taking a nap, which he did quite often. Turns out he said he had the flu and people thought he was just hiding, but he had a condition that made him feel ill. Anyway, he got up from his nap and he appeared to be in a hypnotic state, very robot-like in his motions, and his speech was very atonal and flat. But he just said, call the doctor and tell him, well, we called him Dr. Quack, by the way. Call Dr. Quack and tell him that our son has an inguinal hernia. So I did, made an appointment. No rushing to the emergency room, none of that. And the doctor examined our son and referred us to a specialist, a surgeon. So we went to the surgeon and he confirmed the diagnosis and said, well, he's too young to have the surgery. So don't let him cry. For 4 months.
Ow. No crying, huh?
No crying. He could cause the hernia to strangulate and kill him. We had one spoiled baby.
Well,
and I had
that's
no
some pressure too for parents. Like
for 4 months, I had no sleep.
And how old was Christopher at the time?
He would have been 14 months old when it was diagnosed and 18 months old when he had the surgery.
Oh, wow. Okay, very young. I thought he was older. That's interesting.
No.
Okay.
But Phil did diagnose him for no particular reason. He said that our son was just babbling happily in his crib, and Phil heard him saying the words of Christ on the cross. Of course, he wasn't saying that, but from that, he just knew. But he was in some kind of a trance when he told me.
Hmm. Okay, so all right, Ted, I'm gonna circle back though on the fish pendant. Do you think? I mean, a lot of people who come from secular backgrounds don't even know what the fish pendant is, and I do think he chose it or chose to emphasize it for a reason. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on exactly why that is? I like the tangent we went on, but I do want to drill down.
One thought that occurs to me in terms of like the rhetoric of this choice, right, is that I mean the fish pendant is like obscure if you're not familiar with Christianity too much, right? But
Right.
it's actually pretty square of a signifier. It's I think about like how it's like a bumper sticker sort of a thing, right? Like it's kind of all over the place. It's not too challenging. It's not like a weird Gnostic thing, right? And so he's trying to sell his revelation. He's not like Aleister Crowley, like sex magic and drugs and all of this crazy occult stuff. Like he's still like this pious Episcopalian having long one-on-one conversations with his priest, and he kind of like he wants to be this kind of nice domestic, like bookish Christian type. He's not the most wild-eyed of mystics, and so I'm really interested in how the choice of the fish symbol is something that is kind of like it's kind of innocent, it's wholesome, and but it's also part of the diagram of the Gnostics that supposedly made the DNA chain, using the fish symbol, like the geometry of the fish symbol itself, which I haven't come up with any like evidential basis for that being a thing. I'd be really interested to know if there's like a Gnosticism researcher who knows anything more about that like practice, right? But supposedly it was like you would draw the fish symbol and then your friend would like draw the rest of the symbol, and that was how that they in the Gnostic underground society that they would like reveal themselves to each other as believers in the esoteric cult. So the fish symbol might be a way of him sneaking a little bit of esotericism into an otherwise kind of wholesome Christian symbol.
Well, he chose the necklace rather than our bumper sticker, which he had taped in our window, because he wanted to associate it with the character of Sophia in the Valis novel. Especially Radio Free Albemuth, which was actually the first one that he wrote. His agent and his editor kept rejecting them, said they couldn't sell that stuff. So he had to die to get his novels published. Actually, after the Blade Runner film, he could have copied the phone book and sold that. Kind of like, I just blanked on his name, Breakfast of Champions, right after.
Kurt Vonnegut, yeah.
Yeah, right after his movie, Slaughterhouse 5.
Well, so there was this initial day that, but the Valis incident really takes place over several weeks, right? And there's, I wonder what we could go through with what happened over those weeks and what that time was like, Tessa, and maybe Bill, did you
try months?
What's that, Tessa?
Months and years.
Months and years, I know, but those first couple of weeks I think are really, really, really important. Do you have any? I mean, you've got to have distinct memories, Tessa, of that time. Was how much was this internal, or was he talking to you about it?
Oh, he was always talking.
Right.
Even before that.
Mm-hmm. So he was openly telling you, like, hey, something's going on with me. I'm having something. There's something happening at the time. Was he?
Yes. I had enough weird experiences of my own to take him seriously. But he went off the rails sometimes, and I knew that was fiction.
Right.
When I report about his experiences in my books, I feel obligated to record what he actually said and did. But he did make stuff up. However, back to anamnesis, which in Greek philosophy actually happens when you die. You drink from the river of forgetfulness to forget your earthly life, and then you drink from the fountain of anamnesis to remember your spiritual life. And he thought he was doing that. But he recovered a memory of his time in Canada, in British Columbia. He had fled to Vancouver, where he was a guest of honor at a convention, and he decided to stay because someone was gang stalking him down in California. He never knew who.
Right. And during that time in Canada, we know that he had suicidal ideation as well. And
No. He
is that not true?
remembered.
Okay.
He had a headache and was headed to the pharmacy to get some aspirin. And two men in black suits grabbed him and shoved him into the back of a black limousine and drove him around for a while and told him to kill himself. He was never seriously suicidal. His attempts were cries for help, and he was never in danger of dying from what he did.
Okay. Well, that's definitely the way that it's kind of reported often. So it's good to get clarification on that.
This one came close. He took a whole bottle of sleeping pills, and then he woke up looking at the empty bottle and the water glass and called for help.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah, that would be scary to wake up that way. Well, so he had recalled memories of Canada. He started to, and we know that his speech in France in 77, he talked about these experiences where like Thomas, the Roman character, and some of these other lifetimes that inspired, for example, Flow My Tears, and some of these experiences where he imagined, like before Flow My Tears, he imagined this other America and the Second Civil War, and so we know that he had times like that. So I think he had a basis for this, of these recalled memories. It wasn't the first time that he felt like this was happening, but this was different. Why do you think, Bill, as his friend, why do you think this was different from the recalled memories that he had experienced in the past? What made this one different from those?
If you're speaking of the recalled memories in his Valis experience, I'm not sure they were recalled memories. That's how he represented them. I do want to say, just really briefly, because this is a subject that I could go into too much detail on, but there are a set of psychological traits that are common among people, among spiritual seekers. These have been analyzed by psychologists, parapsychologists in particular, and Phil fits the description perfectly. It's like a glove fitting on a hand. And one of them is schizotypy, not schizophrenia, which is at the far end of the schizotypal spectrum. But the near end, I mean, there's a tendency to be very creative, which he certainly was, and to confabulate, to invent things, because that's just the way his mind works. So he would take anything and interpret it in a way that acquired more meaning for him. And schizotypy is just one of the features. The others, these four are all related. There's apophenia, which is the tendency to find meaning in random events. And of course, anybody who uses the I Ching or the tarot or astrology is basically doing something similar. But he would find meaning in synchronistic events happening. He'd find meaningful coincidences. It's all about putting meaning on things that he was very adept at. Another is transliminality, in which the information from the environment or from the subconscious can penetrate through into the consciousness. And the last one is temporal lobe lability, not temporal lobe epilepsy, which is what some people have claimed he suffered from. That's not true any more than to say he was schizophrenic. But again, that's a spectrum, like schizotypy is a spectrum. And there are people who are advanced meditators and sincerely, deeply religious people whose brains will exhibit micro seizures in the temporal lobes, not epileptic fits, but a kind of seizure that you see even in advanced meditators. And there are certain indications. I've seen checklists of questionnaires with the kinds of things like such phenomena. Have you ever experienced a numinous presence of another, and so forth and so on. There's a whole series of these things that fit him very, very closely. So I'm just saying that this tendency of his, a series of traits, not psychotic, not even, it's not, we're not even talking neurosis, although some of these, in severe cases, you could say these would be, you could have, for example, there is a schizotypal personality disorder, which is close to schizophrenia. That's not what he had, in my opinion. I'm not a psychiatrist. But I think there is a trend, there's a tendency for him to make stuff up, to embellish what actually happens to him, to find or create meaning for it in a way that that validates his experiences and his thoughts. And you can say that his mind was perfectly programmed because of his background in theology and philosophy to interpret everything that was happening to him in that context.
Well, because one other thing too to remember is he was also just a storyteller. He was a writer, and so if he's just because he's a storyteller doesn't mean he can't have spiritual thoughts as well, and it's going to come out in a blend because that's who he was as a person.
Well, he was a writer because he was so creative, because of all these other factors. Yeah. And
I think Bill nailed it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
can I break in with one thing? There's a theory that Kim Stanley Robinson brought to my attention. So I agree that Dick's experiences were regular spiritual experiences, right? And he fits this type. One thing we do have to explain, though, is why did he write 9,000 pages of exegesis? And Stan Robinson...
We're going to get there.
Stan Robinson said, in connection with the theory that Bill brought up about temporal lobe lability or epilepsy, is that those conditions are sometimes associated with what's called graphomania, where you do an intense amount of writing.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear more of Bill's thoughts on Phil's graphomania.
We'll get to the exegesis. Trust me.
Before that, Phil wrote tons and tons of letters and so forth. He used to say, "Wind me up, and I write."
Well, and this year, 1974, was a banner year for letters more so than his fiction. He wrote, I've got 2 books on the shelf of letters from 1974 and an index. I mean, like, one of the greatest things that we're given to understand this year in Phil's life is the fact that he wrote a ton of letters and he reached out to people. Bill, did you talk to Phil during this period? Or was it, because I know you talked to him off and on throughout that time, but did you have any direct experience with these early days of the Valis thing?
He didn't tell me about Valis. I mean, we were in touch, but he didn't tell me about it even in 1976 when I stayed with him and Tessa. I didn't really hear more about it. I mean, he alluded to it, but it wasn't directly. I didn't hear more about it until 77 or thereabouts. 77, 78. He was still keeping it a little bit close to his vests, let's put it that way. Well,
and so I want to talk to you about, I hate to totally drill down on these tiny little details, but listen, like we joke about the pink laser beam on our show, and
Right.
and it's become a thing that, you know, the pink laser beam of truth and all that. But I want to talk about like how much of that, because Tessa, you've shown that the pendant is more fiction than it is reality. Where does the pink beam and that stand on the reality versus the fiction of it? Like, where did the pink laser beam come from is what I'm wondering.
It was the beam of light reflected from that window sticker. I've got to take a quick break. I'm drinking too much coffee.
All right, let's pause. So, Bill, you wanted to get into the pink laser beam stuff and give some insight that you recently got. Yeah. So tell us what you got.
Look, it's throughout history, divine light has been associated, physical light has been associated with divine light, illumination, enlightenment, and so forth. So something like the pink laser beam is just another expression of that same theme. And there are events that have occurred throughout history with people who have been struck by sudden experiences that have been transformative. One prime example is the Apostle Paul, when he was still Saul, on his way to Damascus and having a conversion experience that some people have claimed, well, he must have been temporal lobe epileptic. No, he was just having an experience of spiritual light. Or as Ted can talk about, Jakob Burma looking at, I think it was a pewter dish, Ted? That the light of that inspired an ongoing process of spiritual examination that went on for years, I believe. And others throughout history, I mean, this is not an uncommon event. In fact, scientists have speculated that in fact there are phenomena, such as biophotons, biologically induced photon emission that can occur in living tissue. People have actually measured this in the human brain. It may be that our brains actually use not just electrical impulses, but light to communicate with. But beyond that, there have been some specific incidents that have occurred where people have had experiences. One of them famously happened to John Lilly. John Lilly was the psychonaut, call him that, and dolphin communicator and inventor of the isolation tank, who experimented with psychedelics later in his life, and ultimately with ketamine, which he found was able to cure his migraine headaches. He began becoming aware of extraterrestrial entities. One of them he called ECHO, which is Earth Coincidence Control Office, ECCO, which again has to do with how this benign alien intelligence was communicating with people on Earth through spontaneous synchronicities, which is very much in the Phil Dickian mode, and then another entity called SSI, which he called Solid State Intelligence, which was rather similar to Valis. It was unlike Valis, however, it was not benevolent, it was malevolent. So about 6 months after Phil's pink laser beam event, Lilly had a similar experience. He was flying into LAX and he saw the comet Kohoutek, which seemed to him to grow brighter through the plane window. At that point, he claimed a message was laser beamed into his mind, which said, "We are solid state intelligence, and we're going to demonstrate our power by shutting down all solid state equipment to LAX." A few minutes later, the pilot told the passengers that the plane was being diverted to Burbank because another plane had crash landed near LAX and caused a power failure. So it seemed like somehow he got a message from somewhere, and he described it as kind of what you might call a psychic impression. And he described it in terms of a laser beam. And subsequently, Lilly also had apocalyptic visions from Echo, warning of imminent danger to the survival of humanity, primarily coming from nuclear events, nuclear annihilation, which remarkably resembled those described in Phil's famous Tagore letter of 1981, written almost exactly 7 years after Lilly's experience. So there are some interesting points of contact. There is one other one that's kind of mind-blowing, and that has to do with David Koresh. Now, you all know who David Koresh is, the siege at Waco. Well, I hadn't known about this until recently when I heard from Will Morgan, who some of us know as a PKD fan. He's on the fan group, and he's a PKD researcher who's looked into this and found evidence from the FBI files on Koresh and also from a documentary called Waco, Messiah or Madman or Messiah, in which Koresh says that God had computers and an advanced civilization beamed the key to the book of Revelations into his head with a laser.
Wow, I hadn't.
Yeah,
I had not heard that, but
yeah. You really have to dig to find out about it. But I have copies of some of the material, courtesy of Will. There could be a lot more. There could be research into it. I don't want to talk about this too much, especially because I don't have the full set of details. It really requires a lot of looking through the FBI files.
Can I jump in with a note on Jakob Burma that gets us back to Phil and the Valis, the pink beam thing? So Jakob Burma and his experience with the glint of light on the pewter cup might be a direct influence on the choice that Phil made to depict the fish story the way that he did, right? And it's interesting because sometimes, when he's writing about Burma and the exegesis, he's like, I'm only just discovering this. And it turns out that Jakob Burma is like so similar to my ideas, but he already knew about Jakob Burma, and this wasn't his first time. This is something Eric Davis has talked about a bit. We've had conversations with him about this. I think, Bill, you and I have talked about this a bit, right? Where he's sort of like, he's discovering things that it seems like he forgot, because if you go back, you see that he was writing about it before. He's like rediscovering things as if he hadn't already written about it. And Jakob Burma's like implicated in that. But I wonder if Burma goes all the way back to Mr. Tagomi's vision in Man in the High Castle.
That's
interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. Exactly. The piece of jewelry from Ed Frank Jewelers, holding in his hand, glinting in the light, is an early precursor to the fish pendant in a similar way to stimulate awareness of an alternative reality. Put it that way. Really good point, Ted. Yeah.
So
well, which a lot of times
Burma, all the way back.
Well, and people think that the jewelry has more to do with the fact that Phil had and Nancy had the jewelry business at the time.
Well,
It was Anne.
Sorry. Yeah. And then, so they had this jewelry business. And so a lot of people thought that the jewelry had to do with that, but it's interesting to see it from another source. Wow. Yeah.
Anne wanted him to give up writing and just work in a jewelry business.
Well, we're glad he didn't listen to that.
Yeah, well, getting back to his vision of a second civil war, considering the state of things right now, it might have been prophetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, that still remains to be seen, doesn't it? And that's the thing, is it's still a continuum, like what Phil got right and what Phil got wrong, where it's, not over yet. So, so as far as, so Valis as a vast active intelligence system, right? How much of that is purely invention of the novel, and how much of that is something that Phil saw as reality? Anybody can answer that. I know that's a hard question, and I think I know what the answer is, but for the listeners.
Well, he did at one point believe that he was communicating with an artificial intelligence on a satellite with a computer. computers were like, they existed in the 70s, but nobody had one.
Yeah, they weren't around all the time, or in your.
They took up at
your
least the
pocket.
whole floor of an office building.
Right.
Yeah. But he saw himself kind of as Paul on the road to Damascus. Well, Saul on the road, becoming Paul after he's struck by this vision that blinds him, and he's cured by a Christian. And it's his job to kill the Christians. So he's got a problem.
Right. And so, and somebody, one of our listeners wanted me to ask if anybody thought that Phil believed that Valis or that satellite had been there communicating visions for thousands of years to other spiritual mystics along the way. And I didn't have the answer to that, but does anybody think that, I mean, with Paul being on the road to Damascus, is that, to Phil, was the idea that Valis was providing those visions as far back then or in orbit? Did he have any thoughts on that? Does anybody know?
Well, could be. We had never heard of the Black Knight satellite back then, but perhaps, at least to his mind, it was a real thing, an ancient satellite that we didn't send up, somebody else did.
Yeah,
I think the whole AI voice, and especially his identification of it with Sophia, is really a key to understanding a lot of his experience. It's very Gnostic, and I think that's as a source of the divine syzygy he talks about between Christ and between Sophia who fell to earth.
But Phil didn't make a very good Gnostic. He thought God would intervene, and that's completely the opposite of Gnosticism.
right. And maybe for people who are more secular, Ted, can you give a basic understanding of what Gnosticism means, like, for our secular listeners?
Sure. So Gnosticism was a variant of Christianity in the early centuries of the Christian era. So in the years like 100 to 300 AD, it flourished in various forms. So I'm not sure if I can agree that they all would say that God doesn't intervene. That might have been one version, but there's many versions of Gnosticism. There's a book called Rethinking Gnosticism that sort of challenges the idea that there is sort of one umbrella category that really covers all these different groups. But basically, there's this one group of Christians that called themselves Gnostics, who had these ideas about a demiurge that created the universe, but it's not the real God, and it's this kind of blind idiot God. It's kind of Lovecraftian. It like thinks it's the real God, is like creating this universe out of error. And Sophia comes into the Gnostic myth, where Sophia was sort of like prostituting herself in order to like make a kind of creation that wasn't allowed, and so like the basic idea in Phil Dick of reality breakdown is extremely resonant with Gnosticism. Eric Davis has written a really great paper on the Hymn of the Pearl and Phil Dick that I recommend checking out. He's got this whole interest in kind of like signal processing and cybernetics and all that, where like in the Hymn of the Pearl, there's this guy who forgets, and here we are back to anamnesis, right? He forgets his identity as a prince when he goes down into Egypt and puts on their clothes. But then the Hymn of the Pearl is like this message that helps him to like remember his identity as like a spiritual being or whatever, having come from the other kingdom. So Gnosticism is and Dick wrote a very interesting and emblematic kind of like principles of Gnosticism document that's like a one-pager you can read to get Phil's take on Gnosticism. But generally, he was hip to what was happening in with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi. He was hip to a lot of like what was happening in scholarship in Gnosticism, and kind of writing relatively well-informed takes on it at the time.
So Phil,
Well, it actually goes back further than Christianity. Phil got many of his ideas from Epicurus, who influenced the Jewish writers of the intertestamental period before Christ. And so Gnosticism has its roots there, but of course, those people didn't call themselves Gnostics because it was an insult that was hurled at them. But that's really the roots of Gnosticism, is between about 200 BC and 70 AD.
And this is really resonant, this pre-Gnostic stuff, or pre-Christian Gnostic stuff. There's a lot of it in Middle Platonism. If you listen to the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast, you can learn all about the connections between Gnosticism and Platonism, which is, once again, you know, Dick was really deeply interested in Plato and the Platonic tradition. He gets into Neoplatonism. He starts to worry that he's going back to this pre-Christian magic that is like the Neoplatonic, Hermetic, Gnostic kind of like milieu of the time.
And Phil used to quote Epicurus, who was, I think he was before Plato. Anyway, because Epicurus said moderation in all things. And Phil would say, no, that's immoderate. It should be moderation in most things.
Right. Well, okay. So one of the things that Phil himself referred to this time as divine madness at one point. And how much do you think he questioned his? I mean, I think he eventually came to believing that he had a genuine spiritual incident, but I do think that along the way he questioned what he was. You know, he questioned his sanity from time to time on these things. How often do you think that happened? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Because I think was it during this phase that he had himself institutionalized for a period. And I know I've heard the story from Tim Powers about picking him up, which, you know, is a very funny story. But
there's something that Ann Dick said to Dave Gill, which is that crazy people don't have a sense of humor about it, right?
Yeah.
They take their insanity seriously in a way that maybe Phil was a little bit lighter hearted about, you know. And in this, you know, the questioning of his sanity fits into the questioning of reality. It seems like, you know, a rational response to having this kind of like manic depressive illness, this schizotypal, you know, kind of like thing going on. It seems like a rational response to that, to question reality, right?
Absolutely. And I'm not judging, or I'm not saying I agree with it, but I know from the stories that he must have had times where he thought to himself, well, wait a minute, this is too much, or am I, you know, it would be natural for anyone that's really having a genuine spiritual revelation to wonder about it. And so I guess that's kind of what I was wondering.
And and if you read the Exegesis, he goes to great length to kind of like try and attack. Although, you know, Gill might disagree. You know, Gill's going to say, look, you know, he sets up Valis so that he's trying to persuade you of the reality of these experiences. But I think we see Phil in doubting mode a lot in the Exegesis.
Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
He had visions throughout his life.
Yes.
Yep, absolutely.
The most famous one being Palmer Eldritch. He looked toward the sunset and saw a Viking helmet, which the Vikings never wore, by the way. It was some other group. But he saw this horned helmet up in the sky right out of a Faustian legend or an opera by Wagner. But even when he was a child, he got lost once. He was at day camp and got lost in the woods. And he said a man took him by the hand and took him back to the group of children he was with. And when he looked up to thank the man, he was gone.
Well, and
just vanished and wasn't there.
Right. And so in the Exegesis, in doubting mode, he presents a couple ideas to himself the idea that maybe he's speaking to his lost sister at one point, or an alternate Phil, right? Or that there's another Phil communicating to him via Valis, right?
Kind of like Doctor Who.
Right. But I think it's important that people understand that's a part of the exegesis, and that's a part of the story that Phil was at least questioning, these things, because I think people who are too rational, right, a lot of times they'll just write it off as saying he was nuts. And I think what you were saying, Ted, about that Anne said, that him joking about it is important.
I'll go further. I'll say that he's doing a kind of a paranoid criticism. I'd love to hear Bill's response to that.
Paranoid criticism, that's a good one. He was certainly not only capable of, but frequently given to self-examination, which I think is one of Phil's many saving points, one of his graces, that he was always able to, when confronted with an issue, took him a while sometimes, but he was always able to look at what was going on and to come to terms with it, or to find new meaning in it. I'm not sure how much paranoia would have to do with it, though. But
I mean, in the sense of like Dali and the surrealists, like doing a kind of like a paranoid critique of reality.
I think it's a good point. Not sure how to respond to it, though.
All right, so let's get into the exegesis here too, because Bill, you said something offline to me that I thought was really interesting, which was that you cued into the first 150 pages of the exegesis more so than the rest of it, and I want to talk about this process of him putting down these thoughts over several years, right? So we have the initial incident, and then in many ways the Valis incident lasts much longer into and affected his output as a writer, and it changed everything that he did as a writer after that. But what is it about those first 150 pages that you think, Bill, is so different?
I think I can give a real perspective on this, and based on my own experience as well. So what I see is going on is that he has the spiritual revelation, which is very intense and transformative. His life changes. He talks about his life being reorganized, reordered, paying off, clearing his debts, getting money from people who owed him. And then he still is illuminated by that initial flash and wants to perpetuate it. So the part of the exegesis that's, let's say, roughly the first 150 pages is the part that's closest to his initial experience. And it's the part that retains the most of the intensity and purity of his original vision. After a while, that fades off, and he keeps trying to recapture it. That's what all the rest of the book is about. There are some brilliant insights in the rest of the book, but it's all about trying to recapitulate what he previously experienced. He wants that spiritual hit again, and he can't get it. And he keeps going back and back and saying, aha, I have it. I've got the revelation. I have the understanding. And then, no, that's not what I meant at all. He'll look in the morning at what he's written and say, no, this isn't it. He keeps missing the mark, but he keeps searching. Again, another one of his saving graces is that he keeps on looking, but that got carried perhaps to too much an extent when he was trying to recreate the initial intensity of his spiritual vision. I can give a little perspective on this from a personal point of view if you want to hear it.
Sure, absolutely.
It was about it was about a year after his death. It was around 82 or 83 that I came home from a meditation retreat. And I got hit in the head with 3 beams of white light. And I really perceived them as beams because they were very tightly focused, like lasers, coming from elsewhere in the universe. And I downloaded a whole lot of information. And to give you an example of what that would look like, I mean, one of these downloads, at first I was seeing mathematical equations from physics, because that was my field. That was what's in my consciousness. Just like in Phil's consciousness was all this philosophy and theology. So what got excited was what I knew, just as what happened with Phil. Then the images of the equations changed into pictures of Sanskrit letters, and then into other kinds of lettering, all sacred writing, Chinese, Japanese, Islamic, and eventually just the pure colors and forms. And I call it an info dump because I didn't realize at that time how much that was going to change my life. It was about a year or two after I'd had a spiritual awakening. I never got the chance to discuss my awakening with Phil because he died before I came back to California where I could discuss it with him. But it's something that happened to me around 81 and progressed through. And it's actually still ongoing. And, you know, I've also managed to retain my sanity during almost all of it. So I've been able to integrate the experience. And again, this kind of experience is not that uncommon among other people. There are websites involving offering descriptions of people who have gone through awakenings of one kind or another, Kundalini experiences or whatever. In my case, I was on the verge of spiritual discovery. I'd had another paper at 82 published in a scientific journal, paper in physics. And I knew my life was about to change. And that's when I went into, I studied channeling at one point. Channeling, no, not entities, just my higher self, so I could get the higher truth through. And my life totally changed. At that point, I became a healer and a biochemist and worked with a partner, developed new products, got a patent on one of them, started a corporation. All of this came from that initial flood of information. So, and I can well understand it, that first couple of years when it was so vivid, when I could do things like look at people and see brilliantly colored auras around them, or even see the electrical conduits in the walls, or access information psychically that I had no idea I could do. It was all sort of a game to me. I didn't realize it was kind of fun to play with. And it faded off after a while. And then I kept, oh, gee, how do I get back to that? But it didn't drive me into the kind of pursuit that Phil did. And I suspect that's because, as Ted mentioned, his hypergraphia or graphomania, which was very strongly pronounced. I mean, he was a writer after all, but he just insisted. He kept trying to process what he'd learned and to get back to that state. In my case, I went off in a different direction and just continued to explore spirituality and healing work. And I'm still doing it to this very day. But it is possible to have that kind of experience and remain fully grounded and not be psychotic. And
right, absolutely. And
I think that's true for Phil too. I don't think he was psychotic. I think he had a big opening, which knocked him for a loop because he was deeply neurotic. But then he retained some contact with reality, as his friends like Tim Powers and Blaylock and other people who knew him at that time will testify. He seemed perfectly normal. He would just stay up all night writing. That's all.
I'd like to break in here with a $10 theology word. You know, popular in theological circles at the time was the eclipse of God, right? And, you know, as Bill was saying, you know, Phil's always like trying to get back these experiences where, you know, he's no longer like feeling this divine presence, and he's like in this sort of dark night of the soul. And so I think that the eclipse of God really conditions. So if we're trying to think about this like doubting mode, you know, I mean, he's also in kind of like eclipse of God mode. Like, why is it like there's a theological significance to this absence?
Mm-hmm.
Good point.
Well, Tessa, I'm wondering, while he was working on the exegesis, did he ever have any intention of publishing it? What was his intentions in writing this?
He wanted to turn it into an academic paper. He wanted very badly to be taken seriously by people in general and academics in particular. So what we call the exegesis is really just his notes and outlines, not a finished product.
It's quite an outline. Yeah, right. Well, and at what point did he decide that, like, hey, I'm a science fiction writer, I can communicate these issues through the novel? And you said it was Radio Free that he attempted first, right?
Right. And it's my favorite of the Valis novels, even though it is not included in the Valis trilogy, because nobody asked me when they decided that the transmigration of Timothy Archer should go into a trilogy. They just wanted a trilogy and they grabbed whatever they could.
And so, but you think Radio Free, I think most people consider Radio Free to be connected to Valis. So, like,
yeah, it was originally titled Valis. It was the first one. And actually, it's the most cogent of the three. It has a plot you can follow and ideas you can understand.
Right. And that is one of the ones that I read before starting the podcast forever ago.
Good for you. The movie's good too.
Yeah.
I won't get car chases and explosions because it's low budget, but it doesn't need them.
No, of course it doesn't. But and I will say that just from a perspective of somebody who read those fictional I read Valis and Radio Free back in the day, and so my perspective on this is somebody who is waiting to read the exegesis for this podcast. I've read bits and pieces through articles and excerpts and those kinds of things, but I've been kind of saving it and for this experience. And so what's interesting to me is that I more know it by reputation than I do having experienced it. But I feel like at the same time, you get a really good view into what happened to Phil by the fictional novels. And I do think that they do a good job of doing that. But
I think so.
Yeah.
Of course, the published book is mostly his letters.
Yeah.
But you can access I think most of his handwritten notes at Zebrapedia. I think it's .edu.
Well,
there's a 6,000 page PDF of it that you can get.
Where?
And Ted, have you read the whole thing?
I can't even make out, I'm not a paleography guy. I can't even make out the handwriting, but I believe there's a transcript. I have not attempted the eye-burning experience. However, Pamela Jackson has. She's read the whole thing a couple of times. I mean, she read it on paper, right? Going through those folders. But there's a lot of people who are fan transcribing it. There's a bunch of exegesis experts out there that I'd love to get to know and hear more from.
Zebrapedia
eventually,
has transcripts,
that'll be a
many of
panel.
which have errors.
Can we, before we move on, can I ask Tessa more about Phil's relationship to academia and his ambitions to turn the exegesis into more of a formal paper? Because, like, I remember, his experience at UC Berkeley was kind of a negative one, and he's doing theology in a mode that is not necessarily, it's like Jeffrey Kripal, the religious studies scholar who's interested in Dick, would emphasize the extraordinary experience aspect, right? But I would, and somebody like Gabriel McKee is working on his more theological pretensions. I would say that Dick did want to be taken seriously as a theologian, but at the same time, he's also basing his theology on experience, which is kind of challenging and doesn't necessarily fit with the academic mode. So, Tessa, can you say more about what Dick might have told you about his feelings about academia?
Well, first, he had a good relationship with Dr. McNally at Cal State Fullerton and with the lady who, I've forgotten her name, but she was in charge of the special collections where they had many of Phil's papers before his daughters sued them and demanded them to take them to Berkeley, where no one ever looks at them.
Gil does.
Good.
Talk to Stephen Black at Berkeley about that if anyone's interested.
Yeah.
Now, you're referring to Gil, who has a YouTube channel, Cardinal Sin?
No, David Gill, the true.
Oh, David Gill.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. He's a professor there.
Yeah, well, I know he's gone to that collection because he talked about it on our podcast about like having to go through the lawyers and everything. So it's unfortunate the way that went down, but yes.
Well, his daughters never knew him. Isa spent some time with him here and there, but Laura didn't really remember him. She'd seen him when she was 6 years old, and then the second time she was 19. Anne was furious about keeping him away from his daughter, and he never knew why.
Well,
it was some family drama that I don't want to go into right now. But anyway, Phil was often told his opinions didn't count because he didn't have a college degree. It's kind of like the attitude of many scientists and doctors. Well, you didn't study this, so it doesn't matter what you think.
Right.
So I went ahead and got my master's, but it's in English literature, so scientists don't listen to me either.
Well, I do think it's interesting that did he see this as was he wanting to do this as a compact article or just
more like a book length thesis?
Okay.
Something like a PhD thesis.
I do think that gets lost for people, that what he was writing was just the notes that he was trying to compile for it. And that would make sense too, that sometimes, and I know, like I said, I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read bits and pieces of it, that some of it is conversational in the tone where he's just kind of offhandedly mentioning earlier works and things like that. It's obvious he was not intending for that that he was speaking to himself. I know when I make notes for the podcast, a lot of times, we release those to our patrons, and I'm a lot of times like, well, good luck trying to understand what my notes are saying, because I'm just trying to clue myself in, hey, don't forget to ask Bill about this, right? But they don't necessarily make sense to anyone else. So I would think the exegesis is a lot of that, right? And so
right. Well, I can read his handwriting, but it's slow work.
Right.
I have done a little transcribing on Zebrapedia, and I've tried to correct errors that other people made because his handwriting, he should have been a doctor. It's that bad.
Bill, you had.
Just say, I've had a lot of fun helping Hélène Collin, who's the French translator of the Exegesis, work on her version, because we had to go back to the original and check the spelling of certain words that didn't seem to make sense, and then look at the copies in Zebrapedia to make sense. So in a sense, the most accurate version of the Exegesis is the one that's been published in French.
Well, and that's fitting because of his relationship with France as well.
He got most of his income from French royalties.
Yeah,
I tried to learn French, and I can read it with a dictionary, but it just isn't in my DNA.
Well, so he continued to, obviously he kept writing fiction, and there was a little bit of non-Valis fiction after this. Was Scanner Darkly written after the Valis?
No,
No, it was before. Okay.
he wrote that in 72.
Gotcha. Okay, so I haven't gotten there yet with podcasts, so I don't. I have read Scanner Darkly just many years ago.
Well, I think it was published in 76. It took that long.
I think it was 77, but it could be wrong. But as far as what his fiction after this point became much more optimistic in a sense, and it kind of changed this whole his tone changed fictionally. I'm wondering how did Phil come off as a more optimistic person after this, because the fiction definitely does, in my opinion.
Well, the gang stalking came to an end, and when he was sure that it really had ended, he felt more secure. He had been followed, spied on, had his house torn apart several times.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And
the Paul Williams interviews definitely make that clear. That
yeah, I met a lady who saw his house after the big break-in.
Mhm.
She confirmed it was really major. It was not the work of one person.
Gotcha.
And according to Phil, the county sheriff told him he should leave town because he'd end up dead or worse.
Yeah, that's not what you want to hear from law enforcement. I don't think you want to hear that. Yeah. So, but this period though, with the writing, that everything became more. I think. But what I'm really trying to drill down on is did he feel more comfortable as a person, as a spiritual being after the Valis incident? Did he? Because he was always a person that felt kind of offbeat with the world, right? Like, and that led to his agoraphobia in the early years, and him not wanting to join writers groups, and to, when he was sending other writers to take his work to Tony Boucher and stuff like that. So, do you think, as his friends, Bill and Tessa, like as people who were close to him, do you feel that this freed him in a way at all, like this experience? Bill, let's start with you.
I think to some extent it did. He seemed happier in general, but there were definite depressive moments. I visited him one time right after, his mother had died. He actually, in a kind of, as I recall, in kind of a parallel incident to his own death years later, he had to be the one who decided to turn off life support for her. I think that was in 78. I'm not sure. And he just didn't even want to talk to me then, but he relented after about a day. But, there were isolated incidents like that. I mean, he could still be prone to depression, but overall, it seemed to me that the tenor of his life was generally more uplifted. And especially he was feeling very positive about the advent of Blade Runner, at least having sold the material. He wasn't happy, as we know, when he saw when he found out what Ridley Scott wanted to do with the book. Although he did love the visuals that he saw, he said, "You've captured exactly what was going on in my mind." Phil has a way of pleasing people anyway, telling them what he thinks they'd like to hear. But I think he was genuinely excited and happy about the novel. And it's ironic that probably his happiest period of all came shortly before his death. But in general, I do agree. I think his life was more stable in the late 70s, except for isolated incidents that threw him for a loop, like his mother's death.
Right. Absolutely. All right. So I kept you guys for a while, so I want to try and I mean, obviously, we're all very excited about this topic, so I'm sure we could talk all day. But I'm wondering overall, what are the biggest misconceptions that each of you feel like people have for this time in Phil's life and for this incident that you would like to kind of correct the record on, or what would you want people to come away from thinking about the Valis incident and the because this is now a period we are entering in the podcast, right? On this podcast, after Flow My Tears, we're going to do Crap Artist next, and then, but pretty soon we're going to be full on into like Phil dealing with these issues through the books. So, what do you think people need to understand if they make this journey with us on the podcast over these next couple episodes of what was going on with Phil? Anyways, Tessa, go.
Okay. I like to point out that Blade Runner reflects Phil's dark vision of the future, but Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, I haven't seen the new one. Mm-hmm. Total Recall captures his sense of humor, but Phil combined them. He had both in everything he wrote. He was an entertainer. Mm-hmm. And so he, even though he had a rather paranoid vision of global disaster, he also had a sense of humor about it.
Well, his sense of humor is definitely what people miss most of the time. And in a lot of ways, I think Moon, the 2009 movie, the Duncan Jones movie, is almost more... I'm tinkering with an article about Moon being the most PKD movie ever made. Huh. But in many senses. But I shouldn't have given that away. But anyways, yeah.
Also, I'm running out of chocolate.
Oh yeah, well, we don't want that to happen here, Tessa. But but specifically with the Valis thing, is there anything that you think people just totally misunderstand?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the conflation of his fiction with his real world experience, and he encouraged that.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he certainly did. Ted.
So, I'd like to address the idea that the exegesis is not serious, that it's like whimsical or unhealthy or paranoid or druggy or crazy or, all these things. And, it is true that, for example, I talked with Eric Davis about this one time. He says, the unpublished exegesis stuff is often less worth reading, more depressing, more tinfoil hat, paranoid stuff. And, Dave Gill is kind of along those lines too, thinks that it's kind of an unhealthy sign, right? But I would agree more with Bill that, we see that Dick was happier, that doing this practice was sort of helping him get stable. And, Kripal talks in his notes on the exegesis about how it's kind of a religious practice of reading and writing. And, one way to kind of test out a popular theory is William James, who in the Varieties of Religious Experience said, well, the test of a religious experience is whether or not it produces a religious life. And we do see that Dick became, committed to this practice of doing serious research and writing on these theological ideas. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about the esoteric stuff, especially his thoughts on these Renaissance magic guys, Giordano Bruno, Paracelsus, Jacob Burma, and others, is that he was anticipating trends in the research that were to go on in later decades. Not only did he kind of inspire a whole Gnostic revival, but he anticipated a lot of the esoteric studies research that is finally happening in the academic world. It's finally kind of okay to study this material, Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, alchemy, and it's finally being taken seriously. So Dick was ahead of the curve, taking this material seriously as an engaged theologian.
Well, and I have a question for Tessa too, really quickly before we get Bill's thoughts. and just on a personal level, as somebody who does who has been doing this podcast for a while, David Gill said to me one time that he thought that Phil would have appreciated the people that took the piss out of him a little bit and had a sense of humor about him more than the people who like would have been like so serious and very academic about what he was writing, because he kind of had a sense of humor about himself as a storyteller. And that made me feel better, because at some points I felt like sometimes we joke a lot. We take the piss out of Phil a lot as a storyteller, just because that's what our role in the podcast. And I know like Frank Bertram is like hates the fact that we, take him that he's like, Phil deserves better, but I think he would have had a sense of humor about this stuff, and I think he would have appreciated that. Tessa, what do you think?
He would have laughed at pink beam memes.
Yes,
I think he would have enjoyed it, and maybe put out a line of Valis costumes for Halloween.
Right. All right. So, Bill, you're going to close us out with your final thoughts and misconceptions of Valis.
I agree with what everyone has said. From what I've said, basically, I think Phil needs to be taken seriously as a spiritual explorer, and that his experiences were real and valid. He's also a prophet in a sense, and certainly, as Ted points out, his writing is a precursor to a lot of modern investigation. In fact, you can say he stimulated it. I know he was a spiritual mentor for me, starting with Man in the High Castle, which introduced me to the I Ching, as well as a whole generation of people. But and that's the Exegesis has got some deep spiritual investigations in it. I really think the first 150 pages or so are the best part of the book. There's some dark stuff in it as well. His paranoia, not just what didn't get published, as with some of the repetitious or material or some of the paranoid material, but his unfair treatment of Stanislav Lem or the Marxist critics Fitting and Jamison is really unfair and untoward. But that's part of who he was. He had this paranoid streak in him that was part of his manic depressive disorder, and it came out occasionally. What I do feel is, I think we have to accept that, along with the brilliance of the rest of his utterances, his career, his books. So I want to close just with a brief anecdote. About 6 months after he died, I was visiting Paul Williams in California. I've reported this before. I was up in Glen Ellen. Paul, of course, was a longtime friend of mine from when we were basically teenagers together in Boston. And he'd become the executor of Phil's estate. We both met Phil at the same time at Baycon in 1968. So I was having dinner with Paul. Paul was cooking dinner and talking about how Phil would be remembered. And he said that Phil would be remembered as a great science fiction writer. And I said that Phil would be remembered as a great spiritual teacher. And the fact is, I think both are true. It's just that most people aren't aware of that other dimension, or haven't yet gone into that other dimension. But as Ted points out, as time goes on, there are more and more people who are aware of this dimension of Phil's and of its importance. He was really a way shower, a pathfinder for a lot of people. So the last little tidbit around that is as Paul was right after this discussion, or in the middle of it, as Paul was cooking dinner, he was unwrapping a stalk of broccoli, which had the name Silva, S-A-L-V, on the label from the producers. And he said, "Look, we're seeing it upside down. If you look at it upside down, it reads Valis." A little joke from Phil from beyond.
That's awesome. All right. I would really want to thank everybody for coming on the podcast. Ted, I know I got to have you back to just drill down on making those tarot cards. You're all, of course, welcome again on the podcast anytime. It's really important to get this perspective from people that knew Phil. And we're just, our mission, in the beginning was just a couple of friends like wanting to like read a bunch of Philip K. Dick books. And it was funny because one of the jokes that everyone makes about my journey with the podcast is when it was first brought to me, I said, okay, I'll do it, but all I want to do is read the books and turn on the mics, and I'm not going to do anything, and I'm not going to do any research. And now I'm the one that has like 8 pages of notes for every episode, and I'm the one that got way more into this. And I just really appreciate everybody who keeps Phil's legacy going, because I think it's really important. And on that note, everybody, thanks for joining the DickHeads podcast and listening to our panel of experts. And thank you guys for giving me your day.
Thank you, everybody. And the listeners.
Yeah. And yes, the listeners, because there's a lot more of you than I ever expected. So thank you, everybody.